There we go. So we are recording, so keep your lewd jokes to yourself until we stop recording. Then you can go for it. So I first found out about the Amani Institute in 2015 when I first started working for Jump. It's something that Justin introduced me to, and I started looking it up and absolutely fell in love with the program, even though I've never actually participated in it myself. But it's just it's a phenomenal organization that runs a phenomenal program, and I've had the pleasure to connect with quite a few Amani fellows since that time. Personally, I have yet to meet Roshan in live and in person, but we've exchanged emails quite a few times. So Roshan, I'll just let you introduce yourself rather than me trying to butcher that. So maybe you can just do a quick introduction of yourself and a quick introduction of the Amani Institute, and then we'll go into some questions that I prepared for you, and then we'll leave a chunk of time at the end for some questions from all of you who have joined us today. Does that sound good?
Yep, sounds good to me.
All right, take it away.
Great. So thanks, Mitchell, for the invitation, and thanks all of you for joining. Great to meet, see so many jumpers at once. I've known Justin for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now, I think, and usually we catch up when I'm swinging through Bangkok for various workshops and things like that. So, so it's a pleasure to do this with all of you. I am from India originally, and grew up here. I went to the US for undergrad, which is when I kind of went from being more into sports to being more into academics, and became a nerd in college. And like most foreign students in the US, I was looking at jobs in consulting or investment banking and so on, but that would give me the best chance of staying in the US. But my final year of college coincided with 9/11, and that was followed by terrorist attacks in India and ethnic cleansing in the western part of India, and the US bombing of Afghanistan and Iraq. And all of that happened the year that I was about to graduate and considering going to work in management consulting. And it just didn't seem to make sense. Like, the world seemed to be on fire, and what good would I do working for a consulting firm making an oil company more efficient or whatever, right? So that's when I decided to sort of choose a different career path, and started working in social entrepreneurship for an organization called Ashoka, which I'm sure many of you know about, and started working with Ashoka in India. So I returned to India and worked for Ashoka for about 10 years, first in India and then back in the US, in Washington, DC. And it was through that work, working with hundreds of social entrepreneurs around the world, that I started to identify that there seemed to be a missing gap in the way people were being educated and trained for careers in social impact. More and more people seem to want careers in this space, but the traditional academic master's model seemed to be very theoretical, not very skill-oriented, much more kind of research and theory-oriented. And that isn't what employers were looking for. And most employers were complaining that they weren't able to find the right talent, even though we're talking about people coming out of the best master's programs in the world. So I thought, if this is the case sort of in the US, then what's it like everywhere else? And that's when I was also fielding questions from friends who were saying, hey, you started with this like 10 years ago, this career in social change. I want to do that too now. I'm kind of tired or bored of my corporate life. How do I go about having this kind of career? And having done it for about 10 years at the time, I felt like I had a bit of an answer to that question. Around this time, met a woman from Argentina who had a very different life story than mine, but had come to similar conclusions. And so we came together to start Amani Institute. And what Amani does essentially, and it's, of course, we started in 2012 and it's evolved a lot since then, So I'll just sort of stick with the current avatar of Amani. But what we do is essentially help people build careers where they can make a difference in the world. And we do this at the individual level. So we have the program that you were talking about, Michu, and that, it's like a master's equivalent program open to anyone in the world from any background, any age, and so on. And we've had about almost 500 people now from about 65 countries go through it. You can do it in India, in Brazil, or in Kenya. And we usually run it twice a year in each location. So that, and I can go much more into detail, of course, but that's kind of only one aspect of what we do. The second aspect is we work at the organization level. So we do capacity building workshops for NGOs, companies, universities, foundations, and so on. And this is where it's very custom designed to what that organization needs or wants. And it's a really vast and diverse kind of range of projects. But brings me to Bangkok fairly often because I've been working with Oxfam quite a bit, Oxfam Asia. And so both last year and this year, a few trips to Bangkok as part of that. But we've currently worked with, I think, more than 80 organizations in 5 different continents, more than 100 projects in the last 7 years. And they really range everything from a half-day, workshop to multi-year kind of partnerships with organizations. And the other thing we do on the organization side is we're increasingly working with small and growing businesses. So this is a bit more on the commercial or private sector side, but it's really identifying that the big gap towards economic and social development is the growth of small businesses in emerging markets. And the big gap, the big constraint to the growth of small businesses usually is middle management talent. So I know this sounds very kind of niche, but it's actually a really big pain point for most companies. And so what we designed is a leadership development program that specifically targets middle managers at small businesses. And we launched this in East Africa 3 years ago. It's been a big success, and we're shortly going to be bringing it to India and Brazil as well. So far we've had about 50 companies send more than 100 managers to that program. And over the next 4 years, we're going to try to, probably train about 1,000 managers from more than 150 companies in each of these 3 continents. In total, not 1,000 each, but in total. So that's kind of the next big kind of journey for us. And then the third area, what we do is more at the societal level. So it's about building awareness of careers in social change. So we run a lot of events, open sessions, conferences now. So we're sort of getting into the conference running area as well. And it's always around building awareness about careers in social change or the future of impact work. People often talk about the future of work, and we're talking about the future of social impact work. How is that going to change as well in the 21st century? So conferences and events that all help to sort of broaden awareness about careers in social impact, video sort of series and things like that. So I know that's a lot to throw at you guys, but if you can think about it more simply, it's sort of individual programs, organization programs, and sort of more open sort of society-wide awareness raising programs.
Wow, that's awesome. I'm looking forward to dig into some more of that a little bit. Justin, I hope you're listening. We are a small medium business with some managers. Maybe we can get some people over there soon. And just
you're very welcome.
Perfect. And just for a little bit more context for you also, our Jump Impact partner in Nairobi we work with, it's an organization called the Moja Initiative. That organization was started by an amazing human being called Tito. And Tito is like one of the first fellows. I think he's from the 3rd cohort, or one of the very early cohorts in Nairobi. And then we also work with another woman named Sylvia, who's part of that team, and she's also an Amani fellow, an incredible individual. We also had a DT, who some of you may or may not know, who worked for us for some time. She's actually going to be PMing a program next week, but she was also an Amani fellow. And my predecessor, Irene, When she was finished working with Jump, she became an Amani Fellow, and through that went on to work with Ashoka in DC. So there is quite an overlap between Jump and Amani, and hopefully that will just continue to grow. Okay, so if we can get into some of my questions. I spent the past weekend kind of combing through a lot of the content that you have online at the moment, Roshan, and there's quite a bit out there. You have a lot of talks, you have a lot of articles. All of it's really interesting, so I would encourage everybody after this to go check that out. There's some TED Talks, there's some interviews. He's got some articles on the Stanford Social Innovation Review, a lot of really good stuff. And so there was one piece that I really enjoyed listening to, and that was your conversation with Jerry White. And for those of you who don't know who Jerry White is, he was part of the team that won the Nobel Peace Prize. I forget what year it was, but I believe it was kind of early mid-90s. Roshan, correct me if I'm wrong.
97, yeah, 1997.
Yeah, and so that was the international campaign to ban landmines. And he's an incredible individual. And so Roshan had the chance to sit down and have a conversation with him. There was a lot of great content in there, but there was one question that you asked him that I really enjoyed, and so I wanted to ask you. And what you brought up was that a lot of people who work in the social impact space can usually trace it back to a particular moment or a particular person or event that happened that inspired them to go down this track. And so you talked a little bit about your time with Ashoka, and we know that was pretty influential, but can you boil it down to a specific moment or a specific person that really sparked this journey for you?
Yeah, thanks. And also thanks for that sort of review of all the jumpers who've come to Amani and vice versa. I think, yeah, really also I love what Jump is doing, and, long may that kind of pipeline and association go both ways, hopefully. So for me, yes, I can actually boil it down to a particular moment. So I'll tell you that story. But I also want to say that it's not the case for everyone. And with Jerry, I've known him for a very long time. Actually, I know him very well, so I know that in his case, it also boils down to a particular moment. But we work with, it's one of the core things we teach in our program, that for many people, it's not one moment. It's a growing hunch over time, or it's the way they were brought up, or it's just sort of this feeling of there's something more out there, something more that I could be doing, until there's a catalyst of some kind that gets them in that to make that choice. But it doesn't have to be one particular moment for everybody. So I want to say, like, that's not necessarily the case for everyone, but it is the case for a lot of people. And in my case, as I said, it was 9/11, and the fact that I was a senior in college during 9/11 and the year sort of that followed, 2001, 2002, with a lot of violence all around the world. And here I was, a student from India in a, sort of a very rich university in the US, thinking about going to go work for an even richer consulting firm or investment bank. And it just didn't seem to add up. Like, I felt like I had a responsibility to do something more with my education that can help the world be a better place. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it was not going to be in the traditional kind of private sector sort of road. And so that's when, for me, it changed. And then I spent the next 10 years working to support social entrepreneurs all around the world. But I always had this interest in peace building or preventing violence. And then it was sort of getting involved with the education of peace builders that led me to get the idea that, that would lead to Amani Institute. And it's also how I met my co-founder, because she also comes from the kind of peace building background. And even though what we do today doesn't have much to do with peace building per se, it certainly informs our work. And we believe that, if we can sort of solve these problems that we see in society and build more and more people's capacity to be change makers and problem solvers, then we can actually, hopefully reduce violent conflict and injustice and improve human rights and things like that. So I would say, yes, in my case, it does come down to that moment, but it doesn't have to be the case for everyone. But usually you can start to see where the seeds were sown, and that could be from one's parents, that could be from a movie you watched or a book you read, or it could be from a traumatic event that happened to you as well.
Mm. And can I just to follow up on that a little bit? So 9/11 happened. You're seeing all this craziness going on around the world, and your reaction to that is, I shouldn't go down this high profit margin pathway. I should be getting involved in some of this craziness, and helping to foster peace around the world. And that's not, I wouldn't say that's a typical reaction to a major event like 9/11 or any event that causes so much chaos and anger and sadness. And I'm sure there's lots of people who would see something like that happen and say, okay, wow, the world's going crazy. I really need to make sure that I'm taking care of myself and taking care of my family. And why is it that was not your reaction? And why is it that your reaction was, I need to get involved in this. I need to help make a difference here?
Yeah, great question. I think that it comes down to a few different things. One is that I was brought up by, both my parents are entrepreneurs in different ways. And so there's always this, I think when you study, when you work in entrepreneurship, you realize that most entrepreneurs are the children of entrepreneurs. There's something hereditary about that. It's in the DNA in some way. And I think that, my parents definitely raised us to be very much like go and be your own person, get involved in doing things, and all of that. Even though there wasn't necessarily an explicit social impact side there, it was always a sense of independence and make your own choices and do something. So I think that's one piece of it. I think another piece of it is that I've always been a minority everywhere I have been. So in India, I was raised in India, but I'm from a Christian family, English speaking at home, being the children of entrepreneurs, not sort of, don't have great fondness for authority, and elders and all of that. So these are all things that make me a minority in India, even more so today as India goes more sort of right-wing and more into sort of Hindu sort of majoritarianism. Then I went to the US, where, of course, being from India, I'm anyway a minority, and then in a post 9/11 world where there's a lot more, attention for people with brown skin and things like that. There's in the US there's this thing about driving while black, but it's also like driving while brown is no different in some ways, and getting stopped and questioned, being pulled out of lines in airports and so on. And then I've lived in Australia, I've lived in Latin America, and always been a minority. So I think for me, that sense of always kind of being the minority means that you're also always a little bit worried about being the next one targeted in some way. And I think that may have a role to play in it, I see this sort of violence and stuff happening in the world and feel like, I want to do something to make the world a better place. And so I think that those may be some things that are part of that. If you want to go any deeper, you may need to take me to a therapist or something, but that's as far as I go, I think.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you. Okay, so 9/11 happens. You get inspired to start working in social impact. You join Ashoka. During that time, you meet your co-founder and you start the Amani Institute. And from what I've read, you've based the Amani Institute on kind of three aspects. So there is, let's see, sorry, I'm just trying to get to my questions. So there's this idea of building experience in people by connecting them with internships, by building their expertise and building their insights. And so I was just wondering, especially I follow the Amani Institute on social media, and a big thing that you guys talk about is walk it like you talk it. So just going off of those three things, and experience and expertise and insight, I have three questions for you. So what is one of the most important experiences since starting Amani that has shifted your approach to leadership development? What are two key areas that you've personally built expertise in that makes you a better leadership coach? And what are three important insights that you've gained from doing this work? And I can go back and repeat those questions. But yeah, just to start us off, what's one of the most important experiences since starting Amani that's shifted your approach to leadership development?
Yeah, sorry, I lost you for a bit there. I got dropped off. You were asking me about the three things that we based Amani on, and that's when I lost you. So tell me, maybe let's start again and just say, like, what's the question you want to ask now?
Absolutely. So what's one of the most important experiences since starting Amani that's shifted your approach to leadership development? You still with us?
I don't know if you can hear me, but
We could for a second.
Hey there, I'm back again,
Okay.
but I did lose you. I wonder if I could ask everyone to maybe turn off their video. That
Sure.
might help with the bandwidth issue here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mitchu. Sorry again about that.
Okay. So what is one of the most important experiences that you've had since starting Amani that's shifted your approach to leadership development?
I think that one of the most important things that I've seen when it comes to leadership development is the importance of knowing what your purpose is, knowing what your mission is, right? Like, and to be as specific about that as you can, and that doesn't mean it's easy to understand that, but it's really important. And I think that one of the ways that I've learned this lesson, sometimes painfully as well, is in how we recommend people for different jobs, or that we hire people ourselves. And before, we used to be really looking for people who are in general passionate about social change or social impact. And now we're moving to really looking at people who are passionate about building the careers of other people, right? So because we don't even say education anymore, because who isn't passionate about education in some ways? So it's really about, like, okay, do you really care about building the careers of other people? And have you identified that that's like very key to your overarching mission or purpose in life? And how have you come to that, and why is that the case, and so on? So I think, going back to leadership development, I think leaders are at their best when they are focusing on their strengths, and when they are, doing work that's deeply aligned with who they are and what they want to create in the world. It's another lesson I learned from Jerry White, actually. And so when it comes to leadership development, I think there's nothing more important than understanding your why, understanding why you do what you do, why do you want to make change, what kind of change do you want to make, and so on. And I think, like you asked me that really good question about, okay, so other people would have seen 9/11 but didn't have the same reaction. Why did you have that reaction? That's a really good question, because that gets back to questions of purpose and why do you make the choices you make? So I would say, like, over time, I've just gotten more and more convinced about that the key to leadership development is a deep understanding of your own purpose and your own mission in the world.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really great. And I think that's That's really nice for us to hear, especially, a lot of the work that we do is to build up leaders in schools and to build up youth leaders, and not only in schools, but we have our Jump Impact work that we do, um, which is outside of schools and with communities who are less resourced than international schools. And that is what you just said, I think, is a great thing for us to keep in mind as we're working with these young people and helping to build them up, and promoting that idea of focusing on your why. Um, yeah. So another question I have for you is, what are two key areas that you've built your own expertise in that you feel like makes yourself a better leadership coach?
Sure. I think a couple of things that come to mind when you ask that. One is around the idea of reframing, right? Like helping people to reframe something, oftentimes from a negative to a positive. And that oftentimes when we have an experience, we tend to see it in a negative way, or we don't see the gift it may contain, or the potential upside of something. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, one of our fellows came to me and said, I'm having a terrible time in my internship. They're overworking me, and they are. I feel almost exploited because I'm doing so much, and I don't feel like I'm getting enough face time with the leaders, and so on. And I tried to. And there's a longer story here, but the key thing is that I try to help her see that, maybe there's another way to look at it. Maybe that it's not that they are exploiting her or overloading her, but they actually have a lot of confidence in her, that they feel that she can do things with minimal supervision. She doesn't need as much hand-holding as some other people in the organization. And they actually believe in her and feel like she can really shine without a lot of help. And that's why they give her so much work. And she had never thought of it that way. And so I asked her to, have an open conversation with the CEO of that social business and ask him, what's going on here. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, she's still, after she graduated from Amani, she eventually got a job offer from the same organization, and is now, has worked with that organization all around Africa, and moving now to the US to open their office there. So I think that was one really good, that's a very clear example, but I think in many other micro ways, I think an important thing in leadership is helping people to see things in the positive way, or see the opportunity of things, rather than the negative or the downside of things. So that would be one. A second area maybe is around helping people to understand what their values are, and sticking to your values even when you're in doubt, right? So, there's a story I often tell, and you may have seen it online, but we had a really difficult moment in Kenya when there was a big security concern. Our office was attacked by thieves or criminals. There was a gunfight with the police, and a lot of people asked us, do you really want to be in Kenya? Should you move out of Kenya and maybe go to a safer place? And we always said, like, Kenya is one of the most vibrant, dynamic, innovative city, Nairobi in particular, cities on the planet, and it's not as bad as maybe other parts of the world even. So the reason we came here is partly because of these types of problems, and we really have to stick to those values. And in the end, we made the decision to stay in Kenya, but we certainly lost some business. We took some risks there, and I think that in the long run, it worked out brilliantly for us, and we grew very very rapidly after that. Even though that in particular was a tough year. So I always think that when you're faced with existential questions, to have a deeper understanding of, again, your why are you doing this? What are your values? And how do you want to think about this, 5 or 10 years from now? Those are really useful ways to help people as a leadership coach, right? Sometimes you think about it as, what's the long lens that you may want to put on this? Like, how would you look back at this 5 or 10 years from now? What do you think would be important? Things like that. So those are two stories maybe that might help with that question.
Yeah, those are great. And, this both of them spark a few things in me. One of them, it's just going back to that first one in terms of the reframe. So I sent you an email over the weekend and I got an auto response back. I was just looking for it, but I couldn't find it. But in your auto response, you have a really great quote in there. And I could summarize it a little bit, but do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what that quote is?
I don't remember specifically. I always put a quote in my auto response, so my out of office. So I know that. I'm not surprised you saw that, but I don't remember which one it was. I change it every time too. So
So I'm trying to see if I can remember it right. So the quote was around, not getting bogged down that a lot of these large world problems are endless, but getting excited about the work, the nonstop work involved in them. Is that sparking anything?
yeah, I think it's the quote by Scott Harrison, maybe from Charity Water. But let me see. Yeah, I think it's this one. Is it "Do not be afraid of work that has no end"?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Would you mind just reading that out?
Yeah, it's a line from you guys may know the NGO Charity Water, one of the large sort of very successful NGOs in our field. The CEO Scott Harrison recently wrote his biography and the story of Charity Water, which is an excellent book. I recommend it very much. And there was a line in it that I thought was great. He says, "Do not be afraid of work that has no end. If your work is in the service of others, then your work will simply never end." That idea used to scare me. Now it inspires me.
Yeah, I just thought that was such a great reframe. Um, yeah, this is a really good example of a reframe, and that's
Yeah,
the
it's a great example of a reframe, actually. Don't be afraid that your work, you'll never see the end result of all your work. Actually see that as liberating to say, like, let me do as much as I can.
exactly. And then going back to what you were talking about with values, I think um, like that being values led is that's maybe one of the hardest things to walk it like you talk it. Like it's very easy to put your values down on paper and to be clear in your mind what your values are, and then something happens, like your office gets broken into, and there's a gunfight, and there's something that really challenges your values, and that's when you get to see it. Wow, is this really my value? Can I really stick to this? Do you have anything like any advice around that of what, how to handle when the real world pops up and really puts your values to the test?
Um, I don't know if I have like really practical tools or anything around that, but I think one of the things that you learn about values is that values is not what you think, it's what you do, and why you do what you do, right? So
Mm.
oftentimes, let's say you may say like, oh, like I really believe in honesty or whatever, right? And yet like you're stopped by the police and they ask you for a bribe, or you want to get a permit for your business and you ask for a bribe, and you pay that because 1,000 reasons. You need to keep your company going, you need to you need to get stuff done, you have a donor deadline to meet or whatever, right? But that's when you've actually just chosen another value, which is, let's say, the livelihoods of my staff or the good of my organization, over, let's say, your value of honesty or anti-corruption or whatever, right? So I think it's when your values are tested and how you act is when you realize what your real values are, and which values are more important than others, right? So for instance, right now in this world of everything Amani does is global, but we're in a world of rising nationalism and closing borders and so on. And it, in some ways, would be easy for us to actually just run local programs in our three countries and not try to be an open global organization. But because global mindset is one of our core values, and everything we do, we want to always have that global lens, we're actually embracing the harder path right now of trying to be open and global to everyone, rather than try to just get hyper local, which is in some ways would be easier for us to do.
Mm.
So I think like that's, yeah, you really know what your values are when you make choices about what's in difficult moments. So I would say if you look back to turning points in your life. Maybe this is one like piece of advice or a tool. If you look back to turning points in your life, like what brought you to Bangkok, or why did you go to college X instead of college Y, and that's when you'll start to realize what your values really are, and there's no right or wrong there, but it's good to be clear about what really drives your decisions.
Thank you. That's great. It's, values, it's not what you say, it's what you do. That's something I'll definitely hold on to. So I'm being aware of time right now, and I realize I have to pick and choose. I'm not going to be able to get through all of my questions and allow time for everybody else. Okay, maybe I can squeeze in these two. So I was in May, I was pretty fortunate to be able to go to Nairobi for one of our jump leadership programs that I mentioned before. We partner with Tito and Sylvia and the whole Moja team. And while I was there, I went with Tito and Sylvia to go meet the team at Amani, and got to meet Caro and everybody else there, and it was really great. And it happened to overlap with the Amani Fail Fair. So we ended up going that night, and it was a fantastic evening of stories from different entrepreneurs, and different people who were being very open and honest about failures they'd experienced. And it was just a really great event. It brought together a very eclectic group of people. So I wonder if you can, and this is something that Amani really emphasizes that I really appreciate so much, is storytelling. And you live this. If you watch any of Roshan's videos online, he always incorporates an element of storytelling, and he's great at storytelling. So just wondering if you can quickly just tell us a little bit about Fail Fair for everybody else who wasn't fortunate enough to be there, so that they understand the intention behind Fail Fair. Talk a little bit about the role of failure in leadership development. Yeah, and I'm gonna keep out this last thing. So just those two things, just like, what is Fail Fair? What's the purpose behind it? And what do you see as the role of failure in leadership development?
Sure. I think, the reason we do Fail Fair is because you go to most conferences, or you look at most things, and it's always about best practices or success factors, or things like that. But we all know that in life we also learn as much, if not more, from our failures than from our successes, right? And so, but we don't spend enough time in the social impact space telling those stories, like what project failed, like and what did you learn from that? We didn't come up with the concept of Fail Fair. Actually, it was started by in the sort of technology for development space, by an NGO in New York many years ago. But they then open sourced it as an idea, and allowed anyone to go ahead and run Fail Fair events. And so when we were in Nairobi and seeing so many startups in the social enterprise space, and that would sort of shine brightly for a few months, but then fade away, we also felt like there was actually a need to learn about these stories as well. So that was the thinking back in 2013 when we ran our first ever Fail Fair. And it's an annual event that we run in Kenya. We've run it every year since 2013. We've also been running it in India. In Brazil, we use a slightly different format, but it has a very similar sort of set of goals and outcomes. It's something called Fuck Up Night. This is a concept out of Mexico, an organization in Mexico that has likewise kind of licensed it globally. So whether it's Fail Fair, Fuck Up Nights, FailCon, there's a bunch of these different types of events, but they all kind of have the same idea at the root, which is that, can you have people tell stories of when they failed, and what did they learn from that? We are now, as you said, we really believe in storytelling, because again, coming back to the question of values, storytelling is at its root is actually it's about values in action. And so when people tell stories, you actually really understand what their values are. So storytelling is very important in our programs. We teach it. It's one of the core classes at Amani. So everyone who comes to Amani learns about storytelling. But we also use it not just in Failfair, but we also have another kind of storytelling event called Walk Your Talk. And that is where we actually, again, have leaders in social change talk about those moments when their values were tested and they really had to make a choice. And that's when you know what your values really are, right? So we do not just in failure, which is one thing, but we also do it in other areas as well.
Awesome. And you touched on it briefly, but can you just expand a little bit on what you see as the role of failure in leadership development?
Yeah, I think if you want to be a leader, then you've got to, push the boundaries a little bit, right? You've got to help people go to places where they haven't gone before, help an organization grow or do better. And all of this, by definition, means going a bit into the unknown or a bit into what's not there. If it's just business as usual, then I don't think that's leadership necessarily. And so leadership, by definition, means like pushing the boundaries of things. And so therefore, you won't always succeed. You will fail. And so you will fail as much as you succeed, perhaps. And so if you're going to be a leader, if you're going to be in leadership, then you've got to be in some ways accepting or comfortable with the idea that not everything you try will succeed. And therefore, learning about failure, learning about the role of failure, reframing, going back to the idea of reframing failure, not as a loss, but as learning, I think is really valuable skill. It's a valuable mindset to have. At Amani, we have this idea called, it's from improv comedy. It says, how fascinating, like when you fail, you actually don't say, oh, I'm a failure. You say, how fascinating, I've learned something new, I've learned something different. And so being comfortable with that, or being at least accepting, if not comfortable, that failure is to some extent inevitable in leadership is an important, I think, trait for leadership. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's something I completely agree with, and I definitely try and impart that on the youth that we work with, especially young people who have, I think the status quo is to not talk about failure and to not accept failure and to view failure as a negative thing, and that's something we try and focus on a lot, and just in that reframe of failure and failing forward and learning from our mistakes and growing from that and being proud of that. So okay, I've got to prioritize. So this is my last question, and then I'm going to pass it over to the participants, to anybody who's got some questions for Roshan. But my last question for you is looking forward and looking into the future. As over the next 10, 20 years, how do you see Amani growing and evolving to adapt to the ever-changing needs of the world and the ever-changing needs that social impact leaders have in order to make the world a better place?
Great question. We are in some ways in the midst of figuring this out ourselves. So I also want to say, ask me again in 5 years. But but I think, some of the elements of that is that it's going to be more decentralized. I don't think Amani Institute is going to set up more campuses. Maybe one more down the road, but not. It's not going to be a big pillar for us. But we want to try to get more accessible and more decentralized. So that means most of what we do is in English today. How do we start to make it available in other languages? Spanish or Arabic, Mandarin, Thai, whatever it is. How do we start to get it into more languages and help more people access what we do? So I think that's one area of work in the future. Another one is going to be increasingly around working more with the private sector. I feel, I think partly because they have a huge role to play in solving a lot of the problems that, that we face in society. But I also think as at least in the short term, as governments get more autocratic, there's the space for civil society is shrinking. And therefore, if you want to have the widest avenues possible to make change, then actually engaging with the private sector is going to be tactically quite important as well, and sort of reducing the boundaries between private and social sectors and so on. So I think we'll start to work a bit more with the private sector because of that. So I think those are two pillars of how we'll go forward, but it could all change too, where we're actually in the midst of, we're in the early stages of internal conversation about what's the next kind of 7 to 10 years of Amani going to look like. So, so stay tuned for that.
Okay, we will. So many questions based off of that, but not enough time. But as promised, I do wanna open things up. So thank you everybody for letting me ask my questions and for sitting through that. Let's open things up. Who has some questions for Roshan?
Do people mind if I quickly jump in?
Go for it.
Super, thanks. Roshan, it was a fabulous conversation to be a part of and to listen into. My question is around we have such a diversity of leadership now. We have Trump on our right hand and we have Jacinta Ardern on our left hand. Where do you see leadership progressing from here? Are we going to choose one side of this seesaw or the other, or where do you see leadership in the next couple of years tending towards or trending towards?
Great question. I think the best answer is not mine, but it's actually a book I read called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. I don't know if you've seen this book by Yuval Noah Hariri. And I think he makes the case very well. Like, he has the best explanation for what's going on in the world today. Basically that with sort of the increasing failure of liberal democracy, people don't know what to do and how to choose. And so they go for the sort of strongman kind of figure, because that's the person that's saying, follow me and all will be well. So I think we are coming out of that sort of democratic consensus kind of era into one where it's about the strongman authoritarian kind of leader. And, much as I would like to, give props to Jacinta Ardern, I think she runs a relatively small homogeneous country, and the big countries of the world the big diverse ones are all going more in the direction of sort of autocratic leaders. If you look at the US, India, China, Turkey, the Philippines, and Europe, Western Europe, I feel is in some ways the last bastion, but is even in some ways failing as well. Brazil has already gone for a really right-wing extremist. And so I think that unfortunately, people are in general not sure what the future holds. And so then the sort of the call of the sort of strong man from history kind of model is tempting today, and that's why we're going in that direction. So again, it's not my theory, but it's the one that I think makes the most sense today. So I think in the short term we're going to be going more towards the right, but I hope that I think Amani Institute is going to be doing everything we can to move the pendulum back, and hopefully Jump and other organizations and civil society as a whole can put pressure to move it back the other way.
Super, thank you.
Thanks, Darcy. That was a great question. Anybody else? Any other questions? So I have one here from Anne, who sent over a question. She was hoping to join this call, but was unable to. So her question is, what do you consider might be an effective approach to bringing about change in countries where protest is against the law?
Yeah, it's a great, again, a question that I'm thinking a lot about myself these days. I think the answer there is so I think by way of background, I come very much from the social enterprise, social entrepreneurship sector. And so it tends to be not so protest oriented, but more tactical, more, it's not so ideological. And it really goes with like, what's the best way to make the change happen? And so I think when protest is against the law or the space for civil society is shrinking, then you've got to start thinking about, all right, what are more tactical ways in which we can get through the short term? And I actually do think there's a lot to be said in this era for social business, for private sector approaches. There's a lot of organizations, us included, that are by ethos or by nature non-profit, but we are registering as for-profit companies because it gives you more latitude and more flexibility with how you want to operate. Because unfortunately, we are in most countries in the world, the space is shrinking for civil society. So I would say the best solution I have, but that's coming obviously with my own bias and my own background, is to really look tactically at where you can make change happen and who the best partners for that are likely to be.
Awesome, that's great. And then I think we've got time for one, maybe two more questions. I don't know if that sparked any questions. Caroline, you've got a really great question here. I don't know if you're still with us. Are you interested in voicing that question? Are you all right if I voice that question? All right, so I'm assuming that Caroline is maybe not with us. She is in China at the moment, so the connection is hit or miss. But Caroline wrote this question: what are the main cross-cultural challenges experienced when working and communicating in a cross-cultural environment between the fellows and the social entrepreneurs? Any key learnings? I think this is really relevant because we work a lot with international schools and we work in very cross-cultural environments and on very cross-cultural teams.
I don't know if I have like a list of the top 3 or anything like that. I think in general, it tends to boil down to a sense of assumptions around like what's the default mode in one country. People may not be aware that that's not the default mode in another country, right? And so we tend to generally think of right and wrong based on how we grew up or what we've experienced. And we're not always aware that in a totally different culture, a totally different part of the world, there's a very different set of values about what's right and what's wrong. And I think there's an element where you want to stick to your values, but there's also an element where you've got to realize that other people may very reasonably have another set of values. And I think one of the keys to sort of cross-cultural learning or cross-cultural effectiveness is trying to navigate that, and how do we speak in ways that is sort of conforming with other people's values as much as our own. It's not easy, and it takes a long time to learn how to do that, and you may be a finished product with that, but I think that that's one of the important elements to that. So that's speaking a bit more generally. I think most specifically, there's all the stuff you guys probably know in terms of kind of, the value of diversity, seeing that, actually teams with more diverse teams are often stronger than less diverse teams. Particularly when it comes to gender inclusion and gender diversity, that's a really big one, where actually there's so much data now that it leads to much better outcomes and results if teams are more gender balanced than in the past. I think there's all the stuff around sort of respect of the local culture. That in Thailand, I know that you have to see on a day-to-day level things that may not be the way you would do things in the West, but this is the way things are done. And I think that that's true both ways, or it goes in both directions. But I think that's, at the more sort of day-to-day level, it's around sort of respect and for different cultures and so on. But I think at the larger level, I would say it's really about understanding that, one person's right or wrong is actually based on the conditioning of their culture, and it could be very reasonably different in another culture.
Awesome. Totally agree with that. One last question. It's 6 o'clock right now, so one last question before we let you go is, besides Jerry White, who is somebody that you look up to as a leader in the social impact space?
I actually want to reframe that question, and in a way that I think might be helpful, because I think what you really want to know is not necessarily like the name of the person, but why, right? Like, and what are the qualities of that person? And so I want to actually suggest maybe something that's more practical for everyone, which I feel like we often think about the people we look up to as people we know or mentors we've had, and I often, believe that you can also have mentors that you've never met. If you start to analyze the lives of people who have done great things in the world or that you admire, right? So I needn't have met Mandela, for instance, to analyze his life and realize the choices that he made and why I think that those are so powerful. So for instance, the choice to not, when apartheid fell, to not go the other extreme, I think was a really profound choice. And I think understanding why he made that choice and is actually really helpful and can be a role model over there. But I think as a result, for me, one of the most valuable things is actually reading biographies of change makers, and whether it's the guy who started the Aravind Eye hospitals in India, whether it's the biography of the Brazilian diplomat who lost his life in the first suicide bombing in Iraq, when the sort of insurgency started there after the invasion, and his life story before that. I recently read the biography of Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, and really sort of interesting to see that he has built his career now on empathy, which is not the obvious choice for someone who is leading Microsoft, right? But has led Microsoft back into being one of the most powerful companies in the world today. So I think I would say, like, one really great way to find these types of people is to read as much as you can. Read biographies of individuals and see what you can learn from their stories as a result of that. So that's my plug, to read as much as you can, and that's where you'll also find people you can learn from.
Well, that's a great plug and a great way to end. So that is all the time that we have. Roshan, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. It was a really fascinating conversation and really insightful, and I think we all learned a lot. I know some of you who joined the call were interested in learning a little bit more about Amani and potentially getting involved with Amani. Roshan, what's the best way for people to learn more about Amani? Is it just going to the website?
Yeah, going to the website is one. Also, feel free to write to me directly. I'm very happy to email with anyone. My email address is just roshanpaul@amaniinstitute.org, or you can get it from Justin or Michu as well. And feel free to send me any questions you may have. But I'm also the website's also a great place to go.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for joining the call today. I hope you all have a fantastic evening and a great rest of your week. Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks, Mishu. Thanks, Ron.
Bye.